session, including any questions and comments you may share. If you do not wish to be recorded, please refrain from participating in the discussion and keep your camera off. It would be great if you would use mainly the chat to ask questions from the presenters and panelists and to post comments. You can test the chat function by saying hello, and then we will share the slides after the webinar, including links to all the project materials, which are freely available. If you want to use social media, please use our project hashtag #NeverEasy. And then at the end, we have a feedback survey for you and would be very grateful if you respond to that. But then let's continue. So here's the webinar agenda. We will start with me setting the scene. I will briefly discuss linkages between forced marriage and human trafficking, and then I will present some tools for supporting victims of forced marriage from the EASY project that brought us here. Then we have Dr. Mark Salat-Baisal discussing legal approaches to forced marriage in Europe. And then we have a case study presented by Ms. Jasmin Martina Turgut, who is a counselor at Solvodi Mines in Germany. She is replacing a colleague, Christine Holzbauer, who was not able to make it to the webinar after all. And at the end, we will have discussion. This side event will discuss phenomenon of forced marriages in Europe in connection to an EASY project, which is an EU-funded project. It is never easy to talk about this increasing dialogue, awareness, and victim-centered support for victims of forced marriage, and it's implemented in Finland, Spain, Germany, and Ireland. We are implementing this project together with Solvodi in Germany, VIA and University of Lleida in Spain, and Immigrant Council of Ireland. And it is a 2-year project funded by the SERV fund from the European Union. And today also marks the EU Anti-Trafficking Day. As you see in the slides, the linkages between human trafficking and forced marriage are closely linked phenomena. And earlier this year, the European Parliament voted in favor of amending the EU Trafficking Directive, and it now broadens EU's actions against human trafficking and criminalizes new forms of exploitation, such as forced marriage, illegal adoption, and exploitation of surrogacy. And EU member states have 2 years to implement these provisions. We've already earlier drafted and cooperated with UNODC in producing an issue paper on interlinkages between trafficking in persons and marriage. This was published in 2020. The report found that forced marriage is an underreported global form of human trafficking, which is widely then recognized as a violation of human rights, as well as form of gender-based violence and honor-based violence. And according to this UNODC issue paper, marriage can basically be linked to all phases of trafficking, and starting from recruitment and transportation of the victim that then leads to exploitation. But let us go then through to forced marriage itself. So it is a situation where marriage is entered without consent of one or both parties because of, for example, threats, deception, and/or coercion. These acts are mostly often perpetrated by family members or relatives of the victim or by their spouse. When using a broad definition of forced marriage, even an initially consensual marriage can turn into a forced marriage situation if it's impossible for the person to leave the exploitative marriage. I would also like to remind you that forced marriage can touch persons of all genders, backgrounds, and circumstances, rather than only certain persons from certain groups, cultures, or religions, and also persons with an LGBTQIA plus background can be forced to marry. So this picture puts victim of forced marriage in the center. In the middle ring, you can see factors and root causes of forced marriage, such as social exclusion, poverty, gender stereotypes, patriarchal relations. And then on the outer ring, you can say manifestation of forced marriage, which includes everything from coercive control to sexual violence, forced pregnancy, psychological abuse, financial violence, isolation, and denial of educational opportunities, labor exploitation, you name it. Then if we go further. So the consequences of forced marriages are multifold, and we can identify mental and physical harms that relate to severe trauma, anxiety, self-harm, deprivation of self-esteem, memory loss, sleep disorders, depression, and then sexually transmitted diseases and reproductive or sexual health complications. But then we can also identify more societal harms, which include issues such as lack of access to education and employment opportunities, economic dependence, and lowered expectation and ambitions, and social isolation. So in order to respond to these challenges and the multiple harms that forced marriages create, we have collected best practices from the 4 European countries that are participating in this project. We collected these interviews by interviewing experts and survivors, as well as by going through existing literature. The best practices that we identified are available in this report, and they place strong emphasis in the potential victims' safety, their access to mental health services, as well as then general empowerment in taking charge over their own lives. So we also found that victims benefit best from multidisciplinary support, which is coordinated amongst actors who really understand the consequences of forced marriage that we went through in the previous slide, including how it then affects relations in the family and in the community. And then that this support needs to be tailored according to individual needs of the victims or survivors. So this report is available on our website, and we've posted a link in the chat. Then we've just released also a very concrete toolkit for supporting the victims, which features concrete information about forced marriage, as well as checklist, and then this client journey map that outlines features of forced marriage and concrete factors that professionals must take into account when they encounter potential victims and offer them support. This journey map serves as a kind of visual and practical guide for the service providers. And then it kind of maps out the victim's journey. And by understanding this, the stakeholders and professionals helping victims can better address the unique challenges that the victims face, and implement more effective practices. So within that, we have concrete checklists, and which include also tips for encounters, such as ensuring a safe and calm meeting space so that you can talk with the potential victim of forced marriage without rushing and without other people within earshot. Making sure that you and the person understand each other, and use a trusted neutral interpreter if necessary. We also recommend asking open-ended questions and listening neutrally, as neutrally as possible, without alarming the person or questioning what they are saying. It's also important to tell the person that the situation is not their fault. Within the checklist, we also have these kind of reminders of things to remember, things to take into consideration. One of the key things to understand is that being forced to marry and being subjected to violence can significantly affect the person's psychological well-being, as well as their perception of their own rights, and what they consider violence in the first place, or what they consider as normal behavior. Disclosing this kind of situation is difficult, and talking about this and violence requires trust and time. So it may take several meetings for the person to actually disclose their experience. And the person does not necessarily want to or cannot tell the truth about their situation. They want to maybe avoid disclosure for fear of consequences or shame. We've also developed a checklist for beneficiaries. So this is available in multiple languages, which is targeting potential victims of forced marriage survivors. And it has a couple of questions, and then there is also space for different NGOs to use this and put their own contact details in the box. So this is just a way to kind of ask a few questions from the person, make them think, and then if they have questions, they can contact relevant NGOs for assistance or further questions. The journey map kind of describes a process which has been divided into 5 stages. So there's awareness, getting access to assistance, short-term assistance, or in this emergency support, and then long-term support, as well as empowerment. From this slide, you can kind of just see a small picture of these stages in the slide, but basically each stage details victims' actions, touch points, experiences, challenges, as well as then suggest promising practices. And the aim of this is to provide a comprehensive overview of the victim's journey through these different stages. And here you can see an example from the last stage, with this empowerment. And this issue was very important according to survivor interviews. So I would like to read a quote from a survivor in Germany. Yes, so I had a lot of help. I can tell you that I would never, and no matter how much courage I packed, I would never have done it alone, never. And then a survivor from an interview with a survivor from Spain. Let them see that they are not alone, that there are people who have gone through what they are going through, and in the end you get through it. So this is as a reminder to us all about the importance of empowerment. And then we are ready to continue with that. And I would like to now welcome Dr. Mark Salat from University of Lleida to discuss the comparative examination of forced marriage as a manifestation of violence against women. Mark, are you here? Okay, it seems that Mark might have some issues joining us. Yasmin, would you be able to do the case study now and while we wait for Mark?
Yes. Good morning also from my side. I'm Yasmin Martina Turgut from Solvodi Mainz, and I will present you a case study from Solvodi in Regensburg about forced marriage. The case study from Ms. M. Mrs. M was referred to us.
No niin, mä löysin sen linkin. Se oli siellä, se uusi linkki. Mä lähetän sen nyt teille.
Laitan sulle S-postilla.
Sorry, Finns, you are speaking to everybody. Yep. If you can turn off the mics. And Yasmin, sorry. Yes, so we have the slide now here.
Okay, I will start again. The case study from Mrs. M. Mrs. M was referred to us by a colleague from the women's shelter of a police after a police operation due to domestic violence. The local shelter didn't have enough space for her 7 children and was too close to her husband, the perpetrator. They needed a shelter far away, so the women's shelter asked Solvodi for help. Since Mrs. M couldn't leave the flat alone, we had to connect with her discreetly. Her husband controlled her mail, so we invited her to an information cafe for refugee women with an official looking letter. It worked, and she and her 14-year-old daughter attended. Mrs. M seemed very insecure. Other women at the info cafe communicated with her in their mother language. Over time, Mrs. M discovered they had also suffered from domestic violence, which helped her gain trust and talk about her situation. She told us her family came to Germany with a special contingent for Afghan soldiers after the Taliban took power. She had suffered her whole life under war and patriarchal society. At 13, her father married her off to a much older man. The marriage was violent but provided necessary protection. The man protected the family from fighters and financed their life, making Mrs. M and her children dependent on him. The other women encouraged her to separate. Her 14-year-old daughter also felt encouraged and made known her father wanted to marry her off to an Afghan man in Pakistan. This situation highlighted the challenges of regularizing stay in Germany. Women often become the visa that men obtain through marriage. In this case, the daughter was promised to an Afghan man in Pakistan, allowing him to come to Germany as her husband. The daughter confirmed this during the InfoCafé. We saw Mrs. M and her daughter again, and they were sure they wanted to leave. The InfoCafé meeting gave them hope, so we started searching for a shelter. We discussed dangerous places for them and asked if a Solvodi shelter had 3 rooms. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough room for all of them. We then asked our partners for safe accommodation, but we weren't successful. We searched for a women's shelter that accepts people in their asylum process, which is challenging due to financing issues. Finally, we found a shelter in a faraway place in Germany with no nearby relatives. We informed Mrs. M. She told her husband she had a doctor's appointment and was taking the children to school. They met us at the train station. Tickets were bought, and a Solvodi counselor stayed in constant phone contact during the trip. Mrs. M and 6 of her children stayed in the shelter for a long time. Meanwhile, her husband issued a death threat against his wife and younger 6 children, claiming his honor could only be restored by murder. We stayed in contact with the shelter to manage ongoing issues and acted as a communication link to keep their new address secret. The eldest daughter did not want to come with them and stayed with her father. The father had already arranged a husband for her, whom she also wanted to marry. This was very hard for Mrs. M to bear. The other children were relieved to be safe, as they had also experienced their father's violence. We continue to collaborate with the Youth Welfare Office, which visits the daughter regularly and supports her. If she changes her mind, she knows we will help her. Mrs. M and her children have since left the shelter and are now living in their own flat. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmin. We will go through questions at the end and have a discussion, but now I believe we have Mark Salad here. So Mark, now we can have your presentation, comparative examination of forced marriage as manifestation of violence against women.
Hello, good morning. Good morning, everyone. So sorry because I had some problems with the link. Thank you, Nina, for your presentation. The topic, as Anina said, is comparative about a comparative examination of forced marriages as a manifestation of violence against women. I don't know, Anina, if I can pass the slides.
Okay, yes, just indicate next and we will change.
Okay, thank you very much. So, well, the background or the introduction about forced marriages, what I would like to explain is that forced marriages is a victimization process that primarily affects young women and even girls. I think that's important to know that forced marriages is prohibited under international legislation, and specifically forcing a person to marry is a violation of both international human rights law and international treaty law. Moreover, the international legal instruments that most clearly regulate forced marriages were adopted at the European regional level, So it's important to know what is happening in the European space. For instance, the 2011 Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, what is known as Istanbul Convention, plays a crucial role in this context. Additionally, this year were passed two new European directives. Well, one is a new, the other one modify the previous one. The first one is the European Directive on Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence that regulate forced marriages, and then the 2024 1712 European Directive that changed or has been modified the human trafficking directive of 2011. That now, so since then, the forced marriages is recognized as a form of human trafficking or a form of exploitation of human trafficking. Next, Anina. Well, having this context or this introduction having into account, the objective and methodology are the following. Well, the first is to present and offer a comparative approach to the forced marriages phenomenon from a phenomenological point of view and also from a legislative point of view. To do that, what we did was analyze all the data on forced marriages and the institutional and legislative approach to this phenomenon in 4 countries: Germany, Spain, Finland, and Ireland, all of which have ratified the Istanbul Convention and represent different geographical areas of the Europe. So the southern as Spain, Central Europe as Germany, Northern Europe as Finland, and then as well as both civil and common law traditions with Ireland. So next, please. From a phenomenological point of view, we have to say that forced marriages were detected in all the 4 countries. The public debate on these issues exists in all of them, surrounding the criminalization of such conduct in the 3 countries where a specific forced marriages crime has been classified, has been typified, but also for the production of high-profile cases, what we call high-profile cases, showing the reality of these episodes also in Europe and causing an increase of the awareness on the phenomenon. However, we don't have a systematic statistical data in any of these countries, and this leads to the assumption that the cases of forced marriages that we know are only surfacing the type of the iceberg. In fact, the number of detected cases varies from one country to the other, which can be explained by the differences in population, but also by the awareness that frontline professionals may have in detecting such cases. So next, please. As an example of this lack of statistical data, it's the number of detected cases as an example in the 4 countries. Only as example, in Germany, for example, counseling centers estimate 600 cases per year, more or less, of forced marriages, but then the police only report between 50-77 cases per year. Also in Spain, CIDCO, that's the specifically police unit that deals with forced marriages cases, identifies only 18 cases, not per year, but between all these 6 years, so 2016 to 2022. Then the Catalan police has been more awareness about the problem, so the number of cases detected were more higher. But then, if we compare this data with the data of the NGOs, for example, in Valentes y Acompañades, that's a very little NGO that works in Girona, a little town in Catalonia, assist only in 3 years more than 100 victims. As an examples of this lack of data and lack of awareness by the institutional police and other public responsibles. So next, Anina, please. From a legislative point of view, the Council of Europe Convention, the Istanbul Convention, oblige member states to criminalize forced marriages, but it adopts a victim-centered approach known as the 3Ps policy: the prevention, the protection, and prosecution. To meet these convention requirements in the 4 countries, the predominant legislative way of addressing this reality is through the criminal law. In fact, the legal approach to forced marriages is mainly punitive, as it can be seen. Of the 3 Ps that make up the 3P policy, the P of prosecution, that has been the subject of most legislative development. You can see that in Germany there is a specific crime of forced marriages. Then also in Spain we have a specific crime of forced marriages, but also we have a form of human trafficking. I don't know what happened, but the micro was being silenced. It's enough. Then in Ireland, in 2018, they passed the Domestic Violence Act, in which they regulate the forced marriages as a crime. And finally, Finland, that the last country, is the only one that nowadays they don't have a specific forced marriages crime, and they deal until now all the forced marriages crimes through the human trafficking crimes or through the general crime, that's the coercion crime. Next, please, Anina. Well, in relation with the last part, so the concept of forced marriages, in the general idea is the concept of forced marriages followed in the 4 countries varies depending on whether the respective country adopts a legal concept of forced marriages based on a specific crime or not. So in countries where the main legal reference from which to derive the concept of forced marriages is the criminal law, criminal code, a concept of forced marriages is held to be attached to the traditional concept of forced marriages. That's the Istanbul Convention concept established in the section 37 of the convention. So that's the case of Spain. Also, that it's the case of Germany. You can, Anina. Something similar happens in Ireland. Maybe they have a broader concept, and maybe that's because of they introduced the forced marriages crime not just being passed Istanbul Convention, but later, so in 2018. Finally, the Finland case is a bit different because they deal the forced marriages cases basically through human trafficking crime, but nowadays they are changing the legislation in order to introduce or include the human trafficking case or the forced marriages explicitly to trafficking legislation, and include a broad definition of forced marriages. That's something that is pending to be approval by the parliament, and it seems to be coming to effect in 2025. So finally, as a conclusions, we can say that forced marriages is a reality that occurs in all the 4 countries that we analyze, and that policy and institutional measures need to be put in place to address it. Also, the lack of systematic knowledge about this reality makes it difficult to adopt adequate preventive strategies. So maybe that's the reason that the predominantly approach to forced marriages has been punitive in all the 4 countries. One, at least in an initial point, then we have to say that it has been or the criminal law resource or approach has been the preferential, the predominant, but then nowadays it seems that the civil approach, the preventive approach, the protection approach has been improved. Then we know that the preferential recourse to criminal law has led to a narrow concept of forced marriages. And it seems that the recent shift in the legislative approach, which seek to use non-criminal legal mechanisms to prevent the perpetration of forced marriages, has been improved, and it could help to the concept to forced marriages as well to be a bit more open. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. So now that we've had our presentations, it's time for discussion. And you are invited to ask questions in the chat. So please send us any questions that you might have in mind. To start the discussion, I've prepared one question to each of my fellow presenters. So let's start with you, Mark. As you indicated in your presentation, Spain has criminalized forced marriage separately as well as a form of human trafficking. In your view, what are the pros and cons of this approach?
Thank you, Anina, for your question. Well, I think that's the question. It's not easy, and I'll try to answer it the more clearly, the more I can. Well, pros. I think that the first pro that having both crimes, the specific crime and forced marriages as a form of human trafficking crime, could be the fact that if you only criminalize forced marriages as a specific crime or forced marriages through human trafficking, the concept or the crime or each of those crimes are not allowed to deal with all the cases of that represent the phenomenon of forced marriages, because I'm thinking in Spain, for example, we have a lot of people, or most of the crimes that of forced marriages that has been committed are those that from people who comes to Spain, and then or people who's living to Spain, but they are ascending to another country, to the origin country, to be married against their will. But it's true that we have some cases that for some forced marriages cases that are committed in Spain to people who's living in Spain, and they don't need to move for transportation or any of the actions that has to be met in the human trafficking cases. So having both crimes, it's a possibility to deal with more cases than only human trafficking or only forced marriages cases. And I'm saying that because if you only have the forced marriages crime, that's true that you can deal with all the cases maybe, but at least, and I'm going to the cons, as Spain has criminalized forced marriages as a specific crime, so having into account the Istanbul Convention, the concept is too narrow. So the only means that can be used to commit forced marriages is violence or serious intimidation. And we know that in practice, this crime is not committed in general through violence or through serious intimidation, and so that's a problem. And going to human trafficking cases, as the means could be more open, that's a good way to deal with these cases. Then we have a problem in Spain, another problem as well. That's the different penalties of forced marriages and human trafficking. So the forced marriages crime is a very low penalty, and then human trafficking cases for forced marriages in Spain could be like more than 15 years. So it's a really serious crime with a really serious penalty that could be the reason that in Spain police officers and the criminal justice system in general only deals with forced marriages through human trafficking crime. So the problem here is maybe the police is not seeing or the concept, or well, yeah, could have some problems with the cases that are committed in Spain for people living in Spain, and where there is no of the actions regulated in the human trafficking cases as well. So as you can see, I think that there are some cons, but as I think that's more a question of how we regulate both crimes than having both crimes. I think that having both crimes could be positive in general, but then the specific regulation of in Spain had been or had the reason of a lot of problems in our country.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, yes. So it's not just that we have laws, but it's about implementing those laws, law in action, so to speak. Then I will also ask a question from Yasmin before we take questions from others. So Yasmin, thank you for presenting this case study of Mrs. M. You highlighted the multifaceted violence and exploitation that victims of forced marriage have to bear, as well as many challenges that then exist in order for them to seek assistance. What do you think are the biggest obstacles for reporting the crime to the police?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your question, and thank you, Mark, for your presentation. The biggest obstacle is the fear of their husbands or partners, fear of what they will do. Yeah. Another factor is fear of the police. In their countries of origin, police officers are often corrupt, and therefore trust in the police in the host country is not particularly high. They are also often afraid of the consequences. Young women who are threatened with forced marriages are naturally very reluctant to press charges against their own family and parents. Despite all the violence and threats, the love and the loyalty towards their parents is very strong. In the case of married women with children like Mrs. M, there is also there is always the question of divorce, custody, and access rights to the children. Especially with access rights, the father always have the right to see their children unless the courts decide against it. This allows new safe locations to be uncovered. Furthermore, questions about the future also play a decisive role. Can I find a flat? What will happen financially? Will I be able to support myself? Will I find a job? Or will I start an apprenticeship? These are just a few of the questions that cause women to worry about taking the first step towards freedom. And finally, another important point is that these women or girls never learned to be alone, since now they stayed or lived with a big family and together and a big community. They never learned to decide for themselves and take responsibility for themselves. The parents or elder family members or their husbands decides for them. Reporting them to the police brings with it considerable consequences and changes that they are naturally afraid of. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmin, for highlighting the NGO perspective and the many challenges that the victims have to face when they are seeking help. Indeed, these problems are quite extensive and universal in that case. We are a bit running out of time, but our colleague Snehil Dahl wants to take the floor, so please ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I've observed on regular basis that the terminology for the same crime of forced marriages is different in different countries. For instance, the situation in India has been referred as love jihad, in which particularly Hindus and Christian communities have been targeted on domestic level, including the situation at the moment in Bangladesh due to political instability. There are mass rapes and forced marriages happening out of the genocides and the political instability. So how do we handle such situations, and what are the other terms which are popularly used by the communities? Because the terms used by the communities or citizens in general also do not link with the legal term. There aren't any forced marriage acts or offices. But I've observed United Kingdom has a separate department within within their consulates in different countries, specifically dedicated for forced marriages, and they issue passports or visas to get their citizens back. So how do we deal with this conflict of different terminologies between individuals and the legal terms of countries, having another issue of different countries also having a different terms for the same problem? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very good question. And I can kind of say, because we were preparing this issue paper for UNODC in 2020, where we collected data from 9 countries around the world, that indeed this trafficking and forced marriage issue is particularly complex and sensitive subject. Also, the topic of marriage itself and what it constitutes, what it is meaning, is a bit different in different countries, and the kind of lack of sort of universal definition of forced marriage is also kind of an issue. So then it's like how we define this phenomenon, and even like within the EU, from what Mark was saying, that just the definition of forced marriage between the 4 European countries we examined was different. So it is really a challenge. But I think in terms of using the kind of trafficking lens in this context is also important, because if we see that these persons who are victims of trafficking for forced marriage, then they have the right to specialized assistance, which, for example, in the EU include like reflection periods and residence permits options that might not be possible for victims of so-called mere forced marriage. But like ultimately, from our point of view, it is the most important thing that victims get support, and for the victims, the definition itself doesn't really matter. The definition matters in terms of them getting access to certain rights if we define it in a certain way. But still, I think from our perspective, the most important thing is that the persons who are facing this situation are informed of their rights and can get access to assistance. Now we are a bit running already over time. So I want to thank you everybody for your interest. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to the speakers. And we would be very grateful if you could give us feedback on this and stay in touch and have a lovely weekend. We will post the recorded webinar on Heuni's YouTube channel as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Anina. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.